I am so thrilled to be here with these amazing people who all represent different generations, different genres of narrative nonfiction. We have Ken Auletta, who we've been introduced to already. We have Susan Orlean, who has just regaled us and delighted us with her both personality, and you can see why she's the writer that she is just to hear her talk. We are joined and honored to have Dayton Duncan, who is a narrative writer and documentary filmmaker. Who has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, American Heritage Magazine, and most notably, he is a documentary filmmaker. So we are delighted to have someone from our sister representation, actually. I often think of narrative nonfiction when you're writing to be, when I'm describing what it is that we do, I say it's sort of like documentary filmmaking, but we write it. And I think of it in that way. He is obviously most notably known for having worked on the seminal documentaries of the Civil War, baseball, jazz, and most recently National Parks, which just won two Emmy Awards. So we should congratulate him on that. Thank you. Thank you so much. We're also joined again by Hampton Sides, and to my right, a legend who needs no introduction, Gay Talese. And so I was getting a little antsy as the conversation with Susan began to veer directly into exactly what we're going to be talking about. So you'll get a chance to ask more questions of her and all of the people on the panel about the precise thing, which is essentially how is it that we do what we do? How do we survive the process and ourselves? How do we manage a life and narrative too? How do we do that? How do we, above all, I mean, all of us have worked on things in which we have had to immerse ourselves, interestingly enough, because we're not memoirists here for the most part, although you have done that. We've had to immerse ourselves in other people's lives and worlds to the degree that we know more about other people than we know about the people closest to us. Literally in the process of working on my own book, I knew more about the people I was writing about than my own parents, who were of the same generation, which is startling, actually, and humbling, and guilt-inducing on top of that. And so how do we immerse ourselves in another world and have our lives of our own? That's the essential overarching question. And I'd like to pose this to everyone. I don't know, we should start with Ken, I guess, because you have the time constraints. But one of the things I want you to think about is the idea of balancing the intensity of inquiry into another person's life while having to be absent from our own lives. In other words, your life morphs into, on some level, the lives of the people that you're writing about. And then secondly, what sacrifices do you make or refuse to make, actually, in doing that? And how do you sustain yourself emotionally and mentally through that whole process? So those are the questions.
I think I would probably challenge the premise of your question in the following sense. I work at home.
Oh.
I refuse to have an office at the New Yorker because I want to be, I like to be near my refrigerator. But the truth is that as our daughter was growing up, I get up at 5 o'clock, and I have cartons of research material which I couldn't transport and work at 5 in the morning at the New Yorker or late at night at the New Yorker. So there's an efficiency reason to work at home for me. But when she would get home from school at 3:30, I was there. And when she would get home, at first 15 minutes she wouldn't want to. I would say, "Hi, how was your day?" And she, "I don't want to talk about it," And about 15 minutes later, she would wander into my office, which was our den, and she would sit and talk, and I knew everything about her life. And I went to her soccer matches, and I love that. So I didn't feel, I mean, obviously I'm on the road reporting, but I didn't feel deprived. I felt I really knew her in a way. And my wife, Binky, has an office she goes to. And so she would often ask me, what's going on with Kate? And I would tell her all the gossip and stuff. And so I love that. Mm-hmm. But where your premise is correct for me is that always in my head are the people whose lives I'm living. I'm always thinking, who else should I talk to? Do I know what are the questions should I be asking? Do I need to go back out and do that? Oh, I wonder whether I could write this way. And let me just tell you one story about narrative, but in the early 80s, William Shawn was the editor of the New Yorker. And I came into him all excited one day with a story idea, and I said, Mr. Shawn, I said, something big is going on with poverty in America. And I really want to write a piece. And he was very formal. What do you mean, Mr. Auletta? And he talked a little like Peter Lorre. And he sounded like Peter Lorre. And I said, well, Mr. Shawn, you ride on New York City subway, and people are hostile. And you look at the numbers of people no longer looking for work, and they're astronomical. And the number of homeless on the streets, and the drug incidents, and it's not just about income. It's also about behavior, anger, whatever, self-esteem, whatever it is. And he looked at me and he said to me, Mr. Auletta, that sounds like a sociological yak piece. What you need is a narrative. You need a device to tell your story. Take 4 months, 3 months, and go find that device. That was the single best piece of writing advice I've ever gotten. Now, having the luxury of 3 or 4 months to find it is rare.
I guess I'll just expand on what I had begun referring to. I actually got my contract to write Rin Tin Tin just a couple of months before I got pregnant. And everybody said to me, oh, you're so lucky because, it's a fabulous job to have when you have a kid. You can write when the baby's napping. And and I can say now that to all the people who said that, you either know very little about writing or very little about babies. And very little about napping. And of course, I had a kind of kid who was not into napping. And I was absolutely baffled. I thought, I don't know how I can now do the job I do. I was used to traveling a great deal. I didn't have ordinary hours. I'm not somebody who writes way into the night, but I wasn't, when I thought, all right, if he's going to nap from 9 to 11, I'll do a bunch of work from 9 to 11, but it didn't work that way. And so for a long time, I did very little on my book. I did a little bit of reporting that I could do on the phone, and I was just dumbfounded. I thought, I don't know how to do this, and maybe I can't do it. And I'm lucky because right at that point, my husband had sold his company and was flexible, and so we all moved out to California for about 4 months because most of the material I needed was in California, and it was a lot easier for me to go and know I was going to come home that evening and be with them instead of doing a bunch of trips. When I wrote The Orchid Thief, I went down to Florida probably 13 times for a week, 2 weeks, and it didn't matter, I feel like there's a real cost. I mean, I work at home, and I find right now with a kid the age of my son, I find that to be very difficult because he comes home and I say I'm working, but it looks just like I'm playing video games or something. I mean, there's nothing about what I'm doing that looks like, I mean, I ended up building a studio for myself on our property because I couldn't, and I built it thinking he might never find it. And I felt really guilty about that, but then some friends say, no, you know, I leave, I say bye, and I say goodbye to my kid, and I go out, and then I come back in the house in the back, and I go upstairs so they don't know I'm home. And I thought, oh, this is, I guess this is a parental thing that, you know, actually I'm not the only person going through this. And I should say my son found the studio after some time looking for me. It's really tough. And I wonder, you know, I have an idea for another book, and I'm sort of thinking, how much travel would that entail? How can I do that and have a life? And I'm not sure that there is an answer to that. At the same time, I certainly can't imagine doing writing that was all sitting at a desk and that didn't require travel, that didn't involve being kind of out in the world.
The first book that I wrote, I retraced the Lewis and Clark Trail a number of times, and I was single, and so my absence from the house that I owned was immaterial. The second book I wrote was about the New Hampshire primary, following people involved in it from the grassroots level, and by that point Diane and I were married, but I picked the county in New Hampshire where we lived. So the time that I would be on the, you know, following these people around, I could sleep in my own bed every night. By the time I did my third book, which is about the most sparsely settled counties in the United States, all of them in the far west, we already had our daughter Emmy, and we're about to have our son Will, and we moved to Kansas so I could drive, as I had to all of these remote counties. And it was hard because I was, you know, to go to these places were long drives, and I spent a lot of time with people living in places where the, you know, the closest McDonald's was 120 miles, and there might be one school, a high school in a county that's the size of Connecticut that had a total population of 4,000 people. And I came up with this brilliant idea at one point that I would take my family with me on one of my research trips, which turned out to be to the sandhills of Nebraska. And I don't know if any of you have been there. It's a beautiful landscape, but I would not recommend taking your wife and 3-year-old daughter and 2-month-old son with you for that, and leaving them at some place that I thought was sort of supposed to be a dude ranch or a thing of just a farmer's house, and we were located in their attic space, and it was overheated, and I would go out to do my interviews for the day and come back, and that was the time, about the third night there, through clenched teeth, that Diane said, "This is the last vacation you are ever planning for us." And it was. Later on, in doing the national parks film, which, you know, consumed about 6 years of my life, our children were older, and I planned a lot of my research trips early on around their vacations, so that you know, my job, which was to go to every national park for a while, I could bring my family along. So I learned slowly about how to do that, but it is hard, particularly if what you're trying to do requires you to be away from home. There's just no way around the fact that it isn't hard, unless you want to do a follow-up on the national parks film and take your family with you to those exquisite places. The writing portion of it, each house that we've owned, when we bought that house, there's always been this lovely study that we've decided Ken was going to be where I was going to do my writing, and in each instance, within about 4 months, I am converting an attic space into my writing space for 2 reasons. One is the kids have overwhelmed that place, and it's better for them. And secondly, I need to get to my own space. But when I am in the writing mode, research mode, then there's the travel considerations. When I'm in the writing mode, then I am home. Now that I'm also working on documentary films, our editing studio is 5 houses down the street in this tiny town in New Hampshire where I live. So I still get to sleep in my own bed at night. you get to know the people that you write about, whether they're living or dead. That's what I'll tell you as somebody who's written contemporary narrative nonfiction of people who live in small places and try to get them as comfortable as they can be with you. And the only way that they become comfortable with you is that you are comfortable with them and that they understand that you're not kidding them when you are legitimately interested in them, their lives, and their stories. And I believe, as some people have said earlier, every human being is waiting at least to tell somebody else who's legitimately interested the story they've been waiting to tell. And as long as you can make them comfortable with the fact that you are waiting for that moment with them, they will probably tell you that. But you become very close. It takes time. If you're writing about Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery, you spend a lot of time with them, and they become your friends too. And to the extent that that means that when you're coming downstairs from where you've been writing and you're in the living room with the person that you spent all that time with out in the sandhills of Nebraska, or you've just been to Lemhi Pass with Meriwether Lewis and that's where you've been, it's hard. It can be hard in the sense that of the reentry that you have to make into your own life. And the best thing you can have is, someone said, what's the best thing a writer can have? And the answer was a spouse with a steady job. Second best for that, or equally important, is a spouse who is not only a skeptical first writer, but a loving and forgiving human being who can give you that little bit of re-entry space to leave whatever it was that you were wrestling with up in your office, and when you come down in the kitchen to start the night with your family.
It's very tough. I mean, I've got 3 boys, and I'm constantly doing this balancing act. I mean, I was late getting here because I was on the phone with my son who's in the hospital with acute appendicitis. He had an operation last night. He's fine, except that he's missing his senior prom, so he's kind of bummed out about that. But so there is a constant juggling act, even when we go on conferences and promote our books or talk about literature, but especially when you're in the midst of writing. And he's fine. I'm not looking for pity. He's cool. He's going to be out of the hospital in about 2 hours, so he's going to be fine. But to illustrate the point that you're constantly, if you have a life in narrative, and you have a life, and you want to have a vigorous life in both spheres, it's very hard, and it's very much a balancing act. Especially for me, the real hard part is when you enter what I call the pain cave, which is the part when you begin to really assemble your story, and that part of the process when you've done your traveling and you've done your research, you've done your archival work, and then you're finally trying to stitch this draft together, and that's the phase where the hygiene kind of goes south, and you mutter to yourself a lot and you shamble around. And I've found that I am not able to work in my house for that reason, because my hygiene will really go south if I don't go out into the world and confront people a little bit. And I mentioned earlier that I have a coffee shop in Santa Fe where I work, and it's a kind of a regular place with where no money changes hands because we have an account and they bill me monthly. And there's music, there's food, there's Wi-Fi, really good Wi-Fi. That's a key component. I do work there. I stayed in this same chair for 14 hours one day, and they locked the place up. I became such a part of the furniture that they forgot I was there. I don't necessarily recommend this to anyone. It's just something that works for me, and I think the reason it works for me is that although I can't deal with noise when it's my noise, when it's my family or problems that I need to solve, or my dog or whatever, but if I am in a coffee shop and it's someone else's noise, like noise that I don't have to know about, it's stimulating to me in some way. And I think it's because it sort of reminds me that this is a public act. What we're doing is intended for an audience. You do want people to read your books. And something about being reminded throughout the day of this sort of outside world is immensely comforting to me. And as long as I don't have to get up and deal with it in any sort of way. So that's how I get through the pain cave. The other thing is people who write history have another component of this, which is they have to kind of give up the current world. Like I will not read the paper. I will not read magazines. I know nothing about. Apparently, there's this thing that's been going on in Afghanistan. I'm just learning about. This last book was set in the spring of 1968. There was plenty going on in spring of 1968, and everything I tried to read, everything I tried to do, was somehow related to sort of learning everything I could about that time period. So I think historians have this added wrinkle of not only do they have to balance their present life, but essentially you don't want to clutter up your brain with a lot of current events.
I was stuck in 1947 for years.
Yeah. Well, it could have been a worse year, but
Yeah,
it's so true. You kind of inhabit that world, and I become suspicious of anything that smacks of current events. I don't want to know about it till the book's over.
I love the pain cave.
My good fortune has been, as we've heard reference to already, the working wife. I've always had a working wife, and I've had the same working wife, meaning I am without alimony or all the other extravagant expenses of multiple married writers. My further good fortune is in that working wife still works, and she makes more money than I do, which is better for her than me, because I think there's nothing worse than for a woman to think that she is supporting a man. As for a woman supporting a man, that's me. I'm very grateful. My life, since it's been such a long life, along with a long marriage of 52 years, I'm 79. But what I'm doing at 79 is the same thing I did when I just started off in the early 20s, being a professional journalist at first with a job, and then when I left the job, which was in 1965, which is when I turned 32, already had a daughter, 1 year old at the time, to be followed 3 years later by a second daughter. But during the time when I was a father of a 1 year old and my wife had a job, of course, I decided I didn't want a job anymore. I had worked at the New York Times for 9 years. I was 31. The year was 65. And what I wanted that the Times would not give me, or maybe could not give me, as the management was then so different than it is now under Jill Abramson and Bill Keller, where leniency is allowed, where writers are allowed to take a year off or more to write a book. In those days, when I was a reporter, it was unheard of. And I was unable to take the time to do what we now celebrate in this narrative nonfiction gathering. I wanted to take a month to write a story, and that was unheard of. And so I left in 65. And I took a 1 year job. I had a 1 year contract with Esquire, which in those days was a very good magazine. Maybe it wasn't the New Yorker, but nobody from the New Yorker. I didn't know anybody at the New Yorker. I didn't know the great Mr. Shawn that Mr. Auletta knows. But I worked for 1 year, and I took an assignment to do 6 magazine pieces. My daughters were then ages of 4 and 1, and I worked at home. I mean, I did my writing at home. But what I did then was one of the smart things I did in my life. In the brownstone of the building, where I have been living all the years I've been married, a brownstone in the middle of Manhattan between Lexington and Park Avenue. It was then a rent-controlled building, so I was able to afford it. But what I did do was have space under the building constructed for my purposes. It was like we call it a bunker now, but it's a subterranean part of the building. And I knew a couple of workers from Ecuador. I don't know how I met them. They were illegal immigrants, and they had a lot of time on their hands, and I had a little money for them, which was a lot for them. And what they did was dig a hole under the building. It at one time had been, half a century before, it had been a wine cellar. This building, which I started to live in 1957, I actually wrote a piece about this in New York Magazine a week ago, this old building. But in 1957, 2 years before I was married, which was in 59, I took a rent-controlled apartment, third floor, in this building. And then when I got married, there was another building, another apartment in the same building that was available at rent control rates. So we had two separate apartments, one on the second floor, one on the third floor, my wife and I. And then later on, as the first daughter was born, which was in 1964, it so happened that a third person moved out of the building. I got the third apartment, but I couldn't afford all three apartments. So for a while, I sublet the second floor apartment, we lived on the third floor and the first floor at this time, to Bill Styron, the distinguished novelist who was then has lived all the time in Roxbury, Connecticut, but he wanted a place so he could get away from his family and come in alone and work. So Styron, William Styron himself, then working on a novel called The Confessions of Nat Turner, came to live and pay my rent in the second floor, which became his pied-à-terre. And at night, he would, after finishing, he used to write on this yellow line pad, beautiful penmanship. And he would come down to Nan and myself and our little girl, and sometimes guests that we had for dinner, especially when he showed up, and he'd read us sections of what he wrote that day. It may have been a page, but I remember mostly not only the lyricism of his language, but the beautiful penmanship. Some Catholic nun must have taught him how to do it, because I had a Catholic education. I know that those nuns knew how to do penmanship. They pushed penmanship very hard. I'm really trying to tell you that my life hasn't changed, except I've gotten older. And I still work in that little hole under the building when I'm doing writing. What it is really is a converted, what had once been a wine cellar when the building was built in 1871. And until about the Depression of the 1930s, that was a private-owned townhouse. During the 30s Depression, everybody lost their money, and it became what it became when I rented my first apartment there, a rent-controlled tenant building owned by some Park Avenue cooperative who maintained the building such as they did maintain it for the purposes of keeping the air right, so that the sky was, so the people that lived in the 17th floor Park Avenue apartment building, they would look out and see sun rather than another Donald Trump skyscraper pushing against them. So this was the way they held on. This little building they maintained, and people like me rented, and Styron sub-rented, and that went on. But what I did do is, in that great month of wisdom, when I got my Ecuadorian illegal aliens to dig a hole and build me an apartment down there, which was not connected to the house. You have to go outside the steps, and then you have to go down a lower level, and a little spiral staircase down. And it's my subterranean center of learning. And I go down there every day. It's fixed up considerably from when it was first built. No telephone, no technology at all. But I don't indulge in the technology. I don't even have a cell phone. I never use the internet. I don't Google anything. I don't do anything that I didn't do when I was in the 19th century, which is where I come from. And so I do the same thing.
Gay, Gay, would you please describe to the audience what your attire is when you go down to your basement office?
I could dress as I am now. I'm the son of a tailor, and I grew up getting clothes at very reduced rates, which was nothing. My father made my clothes for me. And he set my standards for tailoring at a pretty high level, because he also was that. I can tell you more about it when it's my turn to talk. I'm taking too much time here. We're still on something. I don't know what we're talking about.
How do you know when you're ready to fall in love again with the project after you finished it? And what do you do to prepare to jump off that cliff again?
Well, I think you have to be ready to fall in love. For instance, you were talking, Susan, and I have the same feeling. I finished a book last year. I have no interest in falling in love with a book right now. I mean, I think I'm doing shorter form pieces, 15,000 words for the New Yorker, and I think that's relaxing. But at some point, you will fall in love. And the hard thing I always find is a book is like a marriage, and you want to be sure you're in love. And I'm always worried I'm going to make a mistake, and I'm going to have to get a divorce in the first couple of months and waste all that time and energy. And so you really want to be sure you're in love, and that's hard to.
It is.
It takes time.
First of all, a confession, I have dropped a number of book projects. I think there is a tendency, or certainly was the case earlier in my career, where I felt like I should get another contract right away. And there tends to be a lot of pressure to do that. Your publisher, you've turned in a book, your publisher is excited, and a lot of times they immediately want to know, what do you want to work on next? And certainly when I was younger, I thought, they want another book from me, I should accept, because, gosh, who knows? And I think what happened was in each case, I went for a while and realized that I really didn't feel great about the idea, that I had rushed to the commitment, and then when things calmed down, I thought, boy, I really don't want to spend 6 years working on this. And luckily, in each instance, I could go to the publisher and say, The Orchid Thief was not what my original. I had gotten a completely different book contract, and I just wasn't that excited about it. And I went to my publisher after I'd written this story for the New Yorker called Orchid Fever, and thought, oh my God, this I'm dying to do as a book. And I went to my publisher and said, look, I know this is changing horses in the middle of the stream, but I love this other idea. Now, it used to be, certainly at that time, I had this idea that my publisher was interested in me, and that, so I didn't want to do this book idea anymore, but I wanted to do a different one, that it was all well and good. And that is not the way publishers really work. They are really buying a particular book. So I say this with some caution, because I don't think it's a guarantee that you go in and say, that book that you gave me the contract for, well, I'm not really interested in it anymore, but let's just erase that in the contract and put in this other idea. Because they are going to go to their sales force, they're going to describe the book, they're looking at it as a product. But I have changed. I would say every book I set out to write, except for Saturday Night, my first book, I did change topics. And I think it's just a function of rushing into a contract, and also the truth is that, certain ideas, once you do a little bit of extra work, you think, you know what, I don't see how I can sustain this. It's just a giant commitment.
An annulment of a shotgun marriage.
I'm sorry?
An annulment of a shotgun marriage.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think that when you are first starting out, any contract, you feel so excited to be offered that you say yes. If somebody says, well, what's your next idea? You say, oh, well, all right, I've got one. I'll pull it out of thin air.
When I was doing my first books, that was it. I had very modest advances. I would say on the low side of modest advances, and that was all I had to live on. This was before I married a working spouse. So I was totally devoted to getting to know Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and exploring the length of their route from St. Louis to the Pacific Ocean. But once I started writing, when I woke up at 2 a.m., it was less about the writing conundrum I left behind. It was more about, my God, I'm going to be done with this book at some point, and I don't have anything else. And it was in those moments that lists started to come. And it wasn't, I don't mean to make it sound like out of the panic came, I'd be writing down things out of panic. It was just that panic in the back of my mind, during a day or a drive or something like that. I think, no one's ever done a book about looking at the president. Everyone's done presidential campaign books looking over the shoulder of the candidate and his coterie of aides, and nobody has looked at it from the bottom, the worm's eye view of the bird, looking at the volunteers and what prompts them to do it. And so, it goes down on a list, which eventually then did become my second book. So I think the sheer necessity, economic necessity of knowing that once my book was done, I had to begin on another one and have a contractual relationship that would allow me to help raise my family. Made it, my books were not necessarily marriages in that sense. They were affairs or something. Again, I don't know what the right. I'm lost in the metaphors here, but I had to be moving on. Then, as I started working with my friend Ken Burns more seriously on films, rather than just coming in and looking at things and say, you need more Shelby Foote, which is my main contribution to Civil War. When I started writing and producing them, they were the ones that were topics that were my idea that I wanted to do. And obviously, in order for us as collaborators to do it, I had to convince him of it. And so I had one story that I had been on my list for a long time about the first automobile trip across the United States. It took me 10 years to finally convince him that we ought to do that. When I thought, we should be doing a film about the national parks because, like jazz, like baseball, they're an American idea, and people always treat it as travelogues and nature films instead of a historical notion of this incredible gift that our nation has given to the world and that our forebears have given to us by preserving these places. That took me 45 seconds. So I'm averaging about 5 years, I guess, in the terms of convincing them. But I always have, other thoughts of other things. I've got more projects that I'd like to do, I guess I would say, than I know that I will have the time and energy to do. And a lot of them drop off in interest, and other ones come back, and other ones come up at 3 a.m. in the morning or on a long drive to, out in the woods of New Hampshire.
You mentioned Shelby Foote. First writer I ever met was Shelby Foote, growing up in Memphis, and his son Huggy and I were best buddies, and we were in a rock band together, and we really did try to do everything we could to prevent Shelby from writing his 6,000-page trilogy of the Civil War with a lot of feedback and a lot of wah-wah pedals and Pink Floyd, and he would come up and rap on the door and say, Huggy, turn that racket down. I'm working on Appomattox. And we're like, yeah, right, Appomattox. There may or may not have been smoke in the room. But the thing is, Shelby, talking about falling in love with a project, he did the Civil War initially to make money as a kind of a palate cleanser between his novels. He viewed himself as a novelist and was doing this as an aside. So he didn't really fall in love with the subject initially. It's something it certainly interested him. He was going to do this quick hit thing. It was going to be like the whole Civil War in one slender volume. It was on the anniversary, I think on the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. Well, he spent 25 years on it. He wrote 6,000 pages, 3 volumes, and so somewhere along the lines, sometimes you don't fall in love initially. It's in the doing of it that you fall in love, and I think that's what he did. It is a marriage, but it needs to be kind of like a well-arranged marriage where there's money changing hands. When you look at a subject, especially when you have 3 kids, as I do, you do have to think about, okay, is this something that has legs, that's going to work years from now? Because it's not just a flirtation with the subject, you fall in love and then you dash it off. You're stuck with that book for 2 or 3 years of writing and research. But then you're out on the trail talking about it for years, and people are going to be asking you questions, if you're lucky, for the rest of your life about it. So it better be something that you care about, and it's an enduring kind of caring. It's not just a flash in the pan. And so that's what I look for, I think. It's like, yeah, I want that feeling of falling in love, but I really want it to last, because it's got to last. I think the other thing is just being close to home. Like, most of my ideas come from something close to home. I think that I was taught somehow this notion that news happens in big places like London and Tokyo and Paris and New York, but often it doesn't. The best stories are in your own backyard. And once you find out a story and get onto a story, because, well, for example, I wrote this book called Ghost Soldiers, which was about the Bataan Death March in World War II in the Philippines. And I got onto it simply by meeting a veteran who had been through that experience, who had nearly died in the death camps in the Philippines, and who just told me his story. And I found out more people from New Mexico, which is where I live now, than any other state were killed in the Bataan Death March. So that was sort of an initial falling in love with a subject, because it was something very local that led me around the world, took me to Japan, took me to Tokyo, took me to London, took me to New York, took me all over the world to research it. But it all started, literally in my backyard. So I think that having some sort of local, personalized affection for a story is really important for me.
I too feel that sometimes the best reporting is done from within. Though I've always been a committed nonfiction writer, never tempted to write fiction, I always recognized that fiction writers wrote about privacy. The novelist, the short story writer, the playwright, it's private life, it's ordinary life that they dramatize to the point of making it, well, as in the case of Arthur Miller with Willie Loman, an international figure, but an ordinary salesman, not a successful salesman, as we all know Willie was not. I believe, what can I do, before we had such lofty terms as narrative nonfiction to gather us together, what can I do about writing or reporting privacy? I don't want to imagine it, because I think more interesting would be to break the tradition of nonfiction, which generally wrote about public life, celebrated people, presidents, generals, or notorious people, or people at least who are newsworthy or who were newsworthy. That's what journalism and that's what current event, that's what history writing, that's what biography is, generally on people that you know or know about or would like to know more about because you heard a little bit about them already. But what would be the possibility of being a nonfiction writer, a probing, researching writer, a journalist who can go at some length to keep a story going? What can you do with private life? Can you write and get publishers to publish ordinary people, no matter how well you wrote about them? Because sometimes you don't have a ready-made market. If you wrote about private people or ordinary people that the general public has not already have some identity with. I started gradually to do this. I started in a book called Unto the Sons, which is about my Italian father and the tailors in my background. It did well. I really started, though, to realize that private life or ordinary life could be done even if you wrote about people who worked, as in the case of the New York Times, for a great institution. When I first made any money, I didn't make any money till I was about 38 years old, and that's when I published The Kingdom and the Power. And The Kingdom and the Power got a very small advance because the publisher that gave me that very small advance said, you're going to have a very small readership. Who cares about reading about reporters or copy editors or even publishers of newspapers such as the Sulzberger family? I mean, it's an academic almost venture you're going into. Now, if you would write a biography about the Sulzberger family, there were biographies of Joseph Pulitzer, and there was a biography of William Randolph Hearst, both by W.A. Swanberg, a noted biographer. He said, we'll do that. I said, I don't want to write about the Sulzberger family. I want to write about those people that I used to see in the city room. I want to write about these reporters. They're interesting because I knew them. I was a reporter on reporters before I knew I was, because when you work in a city office, it could be the New Yorker, it could be the Philadelphia Inquirer, it could be any paper. You sit next to these people, or you know them as your copy editors, or you know them as just colleagues at having a beer with them, or having lunch with them, or hanging around and listening to them complain about their lives, as we all complain about our lives. The city room was a therapy center for all of us. And I thought, these are interesting people. They're ordinary people. They have a job. Or so maybe they're not, or they have a job on the New York Times, so you're pretty special there, at least celebrated and lucky to have a job and get paid for it. But does it make a book? Well, it did. And that was my first success. And then I had money. And I got to write about my family a little bit more in the writer's life, and then Unto the Sons, as I mentioned. And where I am now, so I get to the point of whatever the point is, I'm writing about my marriage. I'm writing about what we're talking about, intimacy. I'm writing about I'm writing about my home, writing about my home life. What I do, though, perhaps it's different than many in this room would think it is, I have always kept notes. When I was a cub reporter, I kept notes about the reporters that I knew. I kept letters that people wrote me, and I filed them, and I put them in an organized fashion in a cabinet. I'm a saver. I saved hardware bills with a date on them. And I bought a hammer in 1949, and I know what I paid for it. Now, you have to be pretty much of a lunatic to do this, but part of what you do, if you're delving into private life and you want to write about it as a reporter, you're a little crazy to begin with, because it's very hard to do, to know what is important, because you're so consumed, you're obsessed with the idea of writing about privacy as a reporter, not as a William Styron or Norman Mailer or Tolstoy, but really about factual, verifiable reportage, but about private life. How do you do it? What's the storyline? How do you get away with it? Well, this is what I've been doing, and it's because I think that narrative nonfiction has come so far since I was first aware of it when we used to call it new journalism back in the 1960s. Tom Wolfe invented that term. I never thought it was new. I never knew what it was, and I wasn't so happy to be part of it, tell you the truth. because I was reading great narrative nonfiction long before I was contributing to it. I was reading many writers from the New Yorker before my career, and some of the collections of reporting that were in anthologies, I was aware of them. And I knew that long before Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Talese and Miss Joan Didion and all those other people that were in that new journalism time, there were people doing it maybe better than we were doing it decades before we were aware of it. Marriage is a different subject when you want to write about it as a reporter. When you're reporting upon your wife, you're reporting upon your children, you're reporting upon yourself, and sometimes what's good about it is you don't know who you are most of the time. None of us do. We have so many selves. I've been aware of that. I haven't exploited it yet. I'm going to exploit it in this book, but I hope. But I think that we are aware that ordinary people are not ordinary, really. If you know them well, they're extraordinary. Private life is extraordinary. And all of us are many people, drawn to situations that prompt certain things about us to become elevated to a premier personality, maybe. Or at other times we recede into another person. We conform. We're different with different people. We're different at different times of our life. Different times of the day, we're different. And that's what makes nonfiction endlessly interesting, and the possibilities are just, you cannot realize what the possibilities are if you have the time and patience and perseverance, and I hope I do.
On the basis of that, I want to open it up to questions. I have many more questions. Are there any questions that are related to what does it take to jump off that cliff, which is what I would have asked, is what's the first thing you do when you jump off a cliff to begin a project? I'm sure there are many people in the room who are about to or have in the process of considering what they're going to do, and would love to hear your questions about that. Yes?
You went to see your agent, Lynn Nesbitt, and described the book about your marriage. And the first thing she did when you left the office was call your house and say to your wife, do you know what he's doing now? I'm just curious, you're telling this from your perspective. What does Mrs. Talese think about your latest book idea?
She said he doesn't know the first thing about marriage, so it'll be interesting to read it.
Yes, right here.
Talking about when to jump off the cliff, I'm a freelancer, so I don't have an editor I can just go to and say I want to do this project and get a yes or a no. I have to, do a lot of research and gathering of interviews beforehand, write pitches, and editors don't get a response, follow up, don't get a response, go on to another editor, and so I'm sure many freelancers go through this. So my question is, when you're in the freelance world, how much time and energy do you put into a project before you actually know it's going to see the light of day, it's going to get published, you're going to get paid for it? Because I could, I'm working on a couple projects now where I'm sinking a lot of time and energy into them, but I haven't gotten any confirmation from any editor that it'll be published. So I'm not sure whether or not to jump off the cliff.
As someone who spent a lot of his many years ago jumping off of cliffs on different stories that I wasn't sure would, amount to much. There's no rule. I mean, you're going to know it or you don't. You're going to feel I've beaten my head against this wall long enough, and I've just got to stop beating my head against this wall and find a different wall to beat my head against. I think the important thing that Isabel, that I drew from all the other panels and everything that has proved very true to me, and I just want to add to that, is that you have to. It's a hard life to get going in this business. It's just not easy, and we should not pretend otherwise. There are people here who are of tremendous skills and great success. And for everyone that's sitting up here, there's 100 people who started off, when they did or we did, and never probably got that book contract or got the book contract. I used to know the statistics of how many books are written each year, and of that number, how many actually get published, and of that number that get published, how many of them sell more than 2,000 copies. And I used to have it burned into my mind, and I eradicated it after a while because it's so damn depressing. So you do have to, you got to believe in the story that you're pursuing. You've got to have that passion for it, and you got to be willing to put up with the risk of the poverty and the panic and everything else, because that's the only way that you're going to survive in doing it. And Isabel, I like your analogy of musicians and artists in that respect, of that you're out there trying to do your thing, but you don't know you're doing it because you hope that people will listen to you, and you sure wouldn't mind if there was a financial success at the end of it. But if you start out on it thinking about the financial success of it, you really picked the wrong place. I mean, it's like saying I'm going to buy those 2 extra lottery tickets tomorrow because that'll increase my chances of financial success. You got to work hard. You've got to be passionate about it, and you got to be willing to make sacrifices. And if you work hard at it, if you're hopefully have the talent, and if, I would say for myself at least, lucky, that things sometimes turn out in ways that you never thought they would, then when you look back on it, you'll see this body of work that you did. And in Ken Burns' first movie, first documentary, Brooklyn Bridge, he decided to go interview Arthur Miller, Gay, and because Arthur Miller had written a play called View from the Bridge, and Ken, I don't think, had read the play and didn't know it wasn't about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. Oops, we're not recording this, are we? No. And so he got Arthur Miller standing with the Brooklyn Bridge in the background, and Arthur told him, I don't know why you're interviewing me. I don't know anything about this, but he did, but he said the words that actually are at the end of that first film of Kent's, which was nominated for an Academy Award, and it was about, he said, what we all hope for in the end is that we will make something that is beautiful and that will last. And I think that's what, all of us hope that what we do is that it will be beautiful, or at least elegant or something, but also that long after we're gone, as Hampton was saying, or long after it's written and came out, that it has its own life that is of some value, either for its beauty or for its importance or for what it helped explain life to whoever came across it.
Passion, belief in a project, luck, all those things are vital. But don't forget the other vital ingredient, believing in yourself. No one is going to believe in you and your talent the way you are capable of doing it. Because you can have a loved one or a family member, a friend, whatever, but they don't, you go to sleep alone and you wake up alone and you sit at that word processor or typewriter alone, and you've got to believe in yourself. And if you don't, you're going to get frustrated and you're going to quit.
That's beautiful. Yes.
When you're writing about the past, you're often in historical writing from the perspective as you imagine it of those historical figures with their aspirations and their knowledge in that moment. But you're also writing from the present with the knowledge of what actually occurred versus what they thought would occur.
I see what you mean. Well, I didn't write my book pretending to be there or in the voice. I didn't try to recreate moments. So I was able, and the only way I was comfortable writing it was as the storyteller, observing these lives with the knowledge of where they ended up, rather than some people write historical nonfiction as if you're in the moment. And that just, to me, it was extremely uncomfortable for me to write that way, because it felt entirely false, to make it seem, the voice as if you're there in the room with people talking. Instead, it was me telling you what I learned about these lives that I observed.
I do now a lot of work, obviously, on historical stories. What we try to do in our documentary films is to try to not falsely put people in the moment, but still nonetheless to get them to suspend their knowledge that they know how it's going to turn out. And the way that we try to do that is to, which you can do better in film than in narrative nonfiction writing, is to turn over to those people who were living there at that time, give them their voice. Obviously, it's read by, Sam Waterston or Tom Hanks or somebody like that, from their diaries or their letters. But we give them as much space and as much room as we can, so that they are, we are giving voice to the dead in that respect. And our narrator, and I'm probably the only person here who in writing narration now writes the word narrator, and that is the voice of God. Our narrator is not allowed to have opinions. We don't try to put it in the present tense. It's still past tense, but it's still trying to put you in that moment where those people who you are describing don't know what's going to happen next. So the best example I can give you is we did a film about the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well, everybody knows that they went out and they came back. So that's kind of a problem. That could be a dramatic problem of tension and everything, but they didn't know they were going to make it back when they left. When they lost their first person in what's now Sioux City, Iowa, Sergeant Charles Floyd, and they buried him on this hill now called Floyd's Bluff, they're very moving diary entries from those members, including William Clark, and we let them have their say, and then our narrative simply says the Corps of Discovery had lost their first member. Now, in most histories that you'll read, the next thing that the narrator would say is, and he would be the only person they would lose, on their whole journey out and back. Well, we didn't do that because we were trying to be standing with them as they buried this comrade on the hill. And you can have a pretty easy bet that as they were standing there, they weren't all thinking, boy, I'm glad we got this sole casualty out of the way. They're all thinking, how many of these burials are there going to be, and is one of them going to be for me? And so it's not until they're all the way back on the return trip, where they march up to pay their respects to the grave, that we let the narrator say, point out the now obvious, that he was the only casualty. So, it sort of depends on the form that you're doing and what voice you want to use. Like I say, we don't like to use the narrative present tense because to us that rings hollow. That we are telling admitted history, which happened in the past. But we inject it with the voices as much as we can of those people who are obviously writing in the present, and try to, through the combination of that, ultimately get you to not knowing that there's going to be an Appomattox yet, that on that second morning at Gettysburg, you don't know who's going to prevail because the people there don't know how it's going to prevail. And in our view, that is telling history in a way that is both memorable and also instructive, because it's just like it's letting them know implicitly that the people of history that we write stories about now are just like you and me, in that they wake up in the morning, we don't know, we might have our grand plans of what's going to happen, we don't know what's going to happen, and they're just like you and me, but though they're mortals like us, they did something that at least is worth telling, a retelling 100 or 50 or 200 years later.
I would concur with that, and I would imagine that Hampton, you would might agree, or I'd love to know what you think about the fact that there's a different kind of genre of historical narrative nonfiction that can be based upon, as you were saying, Dayton, the going back and finding actual documentation of what the people have said, and then recreating that for the reader. The whole idea of narrative nonfiction, in some ways, is to pull the reader in so they can imagine themselves in that situation. And a lot of it depends on the material that we have. If we don't have the material with which to do it, then, as you were saying, Susan, it rings untrue. In the case of my work, and I would imagine, and of yours too, Hampton, we had access to people who were of the era. So you're doing interviewing, which is more like journalism or ethnography. So you have the material with which to bring it to life in the same way that we would in any other form of narrative journalism. And so in that respect, as with any narrative, you don't want to tell everything at that moment that they may now know in the current stage, because you want the reader to follow along with them on the journey, on the trail of, they don't know whether they're going to make it to the coast, and you want them to experience that. And so in that respect, if you don't have the goods, you can't do it. If you do have the material, then you want to make the most of the material that you have. But I don't know.
Yeah, if you can create a situation where you're essentially trapped in the moment, you're trapped in the amber, and you don't know how it's going to play out, you create suspense, even in a story that everyone knows the outcome of. I think what can happen also, if you have the goods, is you can slow the chronology down. It may be month by month or year by year, and suddenly it can become minute by minute and even second by second. At the critical point of my last book, just before the assassination of Martin Luther King, because I had the goods, because there were thousands of interviews and photographs and news footage, and we knew what the weather was, and we knew, I know the architecture of that part of downtown Memphis, and because of all that, and you can invest all those details into a scene, you can actually slow that chronology down to the really second by second, leading up to the moment he was shot. So that's what I try to do in scenes like that. And you also hunt for scenes. You actually literally think, how can I advance this story? This may be an abstract notion of something that you're trying to get across, but how can you find a concrete scene to embed it in, so that the story seems to advance, like with plot, like I guess like fiction. We like things to happen. We like people to meet each other, and a problem is solved, and the action goes off in different directions. History has often had a problem, I think, of being working on an abstract plane, talking about ideas, talking about argument, and it's really hard to make a book move along very briskly when you're talking about argument. Like the argument doesn't do anything. You need people, you need scenes, you need to embed all those abstractions in some sort of localized scene that has a timeline.
I think this all speaks to the purpose of what it is that we're writing. I mean, what Susan's work has been, what Hampton's work has been, Dayton, mine, all have different purposes and goals that we may end up having, and building on the voices, our individual voices, so they become extensions of that. And I think that indicates that this shows that there are many different ways to do such a thing. Yes, in the back, that hand shot up, right there. Yes.
There's just a quality about the past. I mean, to me, what it feels inherently false about the past is that everything kind of gets processed into a story. And the present is such a chaotic, kind of random, senseless thing that I wonder if you have any kind of techniques or approaches for, let's say, making the past a little less neat or, a little more like everyday life.
I don't know. I mean, I go back to this. I'm a very old-fashioned narrative storyteller, and that's why my friend Ken and I became such good friends, is because we both believe that that's how we think of ourselves, of our own lives, not just him and me. I mean, we as human beings, how we process information. Generally, chaos is what happens, right? That is what the world and the cosmos is. It's chaos. And we as human beings make order out of it. And the way that we try to do that is by creating a story, and a story has a certain narrative. Now, which is not to say that it's all neat. There is, disruptions in of narrative, of what you think is going to happen and everything like that. I personally, I would not be able to do it myself. And secondly, I would advise against trying it, of trying to say, well, because life is chaotic, I want to write a chaotic book. I just would advise you against that. Just as, in the 1920s in Germany, they got to this moment where they had trying to do, in order for it to be more realistic, they wanted to slow everything down to be as boring as life could be. And there were a lot of short stories and experimental things that were written along that line, none of which were memorable, though they, it was a theory. So. But it doesn't mean, I don't mean this to be flip. I think the trick is because there are a lot of times there are stories that become pared down, so neat, it's going to end up this way, and it's so self-evident, by the second sentence that you just say, get me to the end, okay? So the trick is finding those things that you're writing about, if it's, fact-based, to try to find those things in there that are disrupting where things, whatever somebody's aspirations were, whatever their plans were, or even where you thought it was going, that there are surprises that happen that resulted in the result that's going to happen, and try to find those things in terms of just the architecture of your storyline, and then within the detail that you do, all the details don't have to necessarily be coalescing to pointing toward a sole magnetic north. You can have a lot of details that enrich the story that aren't necessarily slaves to the narrative.
I think this over-tidiness, this need to make a story too tidy, is sort of what got Mortensen in trouble with this latest thing with 3 Cups of Tea. This is sort of like, okay, he went to this village called Corfu, and they treated him well and they nursed him back to health, and so therefore he decided to build a school. But it turned out it was actually a different village. Now that would have been fine, I think. The story would have been okay if he had said, I couldn't get to Corfu, the first time. But in telling the story, he made it all one village, compressed. That urge to kind of make everything tidy is something that you got to resist, at all costs if you're doing nonfiction. The story would have been fine, don't you think? I mean, I think the reader would have gone along with it, but he couldn't resist the temptation, and that's sort of what's getting him in trouble.
Did you have something, Susan?
Oh, well, I was just going to say that I think if you're doing, I mean, the past is only tidy because if you're looking at sort of secondary material that pares it down to there's a gun on a table, a person gets shot, if you go back to the real primary material, it seems to me, at least, and I don't consider myself an experienced historical researcher by any means, but the messier the archive, the better it was for me, because I didn't like the things that were just already so cleaned up that they were kind of monotonous. In the writing of the book, I felt that it was my job to make it feel like the end point wasn't so totally predictable. And in fact, in a number of cases in my book, I step back and say the version of the story that is presented is absurd. Couldn't possibly be the way it really happened, but now that's the way it's remembered. I was working in a diner in Hollywood, an agent came in, next thing I knew I was a star. I mean, and that was the story told to me in several different instances in the case with Rin Tin Tin. And it's ridiculous. It doesn't happen like that. But because I couldn't get the other details, at least I had to say to the reader, and I know that you don't stand watching a movie being shot and then the director turns to you and says, hey, would you like a contract to write screenplays? And yet those were the stories that I was told. So I simply had to acknowledge and I think to some degree you can do that at points where you're trapped by the limit of what you can know about the past, to say, this is, in this case, this is the classic Hollywood myth that is hard to believe, but there's a reason people make that myth. And it was repeated to me many times in the course of doing this reporting.
I'd like just to say that just because something, we're talking about neat and tidy does not mean you have all the answers, or that we're presenting ourselves as having all the answers. What often happens with history is that you do have the benefit of hindsight, to have the material in front of you to be able to get an assessment of what are the options, what are the presentations of what might have happened, and you can do additional research in order to try to make sense of it. I think as narrative writers, given that we are writing for an audience of people who have many, many zillions of things to do other than read what we've written, and that there's often an effort to try to pare down what we have, that we have no choice but to make difficult decisions about what's going to be included. That is the nature of journalism in general, is to somehow find a way to create structure out of what we do know, so that the reader can understand what it is that we've done this hard work for. But life is very messy, and in my case, in the case of my book, no one has ever made this comment, and it's interesting because it was such a vexing thing for me in the course of working on the book. There are 4 people named George in my book. 4. What are the odds? I mean, what are the odds? Out of all the people that you could have interviewed, out of all those people, I ended up with these people, and I, wondered, what do you do? How do I indicate which George we're talking about? It's the husband of one of the main characters. A main character is named George. His father is named George, and there's another George in there. And so, life is messy. Narrative is not always neat and tidy, and you just have to find a way to write around it sometimes. So that's my answer to that. What do you do? Any other questions? Because we're running out of time. Yes.
I just wanted to ask about collaborators, the role of editors, agents, direct collaborators, and particularly with this session and keeping you out of the depression, keeping you going when you think, oh, this project isn't going anywhere.
That's such a great question. What's the support system for everybody on the...
I've always been very lucky and had a lot of great editors. So I look at editors as a positive. In the course of working on a book, though, I think most typically editors figure that they'll see you when you go out to lunch, when you first sign the contract, and they'll see you again 6 years later when the book is done. And I maybe will have people say they had a different experience, but I think by and large, that is the way editors at publishing houses work. And then they either do a very light edit on your book, or you get lucky and you have an editor who does very close editing, but they're not there to cheer you on during the process. They might be if you asked for it, but I don't think that they expect to be. Because I began to find that it was really hard to be, that the project was getting sort of unmanageable for me, and I found my ability to focus was really tough. I hired my former editor at The New Yorker to work with me during my work on the book, and her primary job for 9 months was to call me every day, and that was it. To just call and say, what are you doing today? And I'd say, well, I'm still in 1937. And she'd say, okay, well, good. You think you'll be into the 40s by the end of the week? And I'd say, yeah, I'm going to try. And that would be it. And she'd call me again the next day. And it seems ridiculous, but I found it very valuable to feel that there was someone in there with me who I could say, I hate that. I just wrote a section I hate. And she'd say, just move on, don't worry. It was sort of coaching. But otherwise, I have to say, even at The New Yorker, when I'm in the middle of a piece, I don't generally go to my editor for help then. I mean, I love my editor, but I usually then am talking it out more with my husband or a friend whose opinion I trust. It's just been my habit. And I will say, I'm not sure if I had said to my book editor, will you call me every day? He might have said, sure, but I think it would have been very unusual. It's just, did you have that experience?
No,
I mean,
no, that's what you described is exactly
yeah, and I do think that that's more and more the case, because what they're doing while you're spending your 6 years working on your book is they're getting other books to market. And editors at publishing houses' main concern is once the book is there in front of them, figuring out how to sell it. Much less involved in the process itself. So if you're somebody who feels you would do better with someone who you can brainstorm with all along, you might end up doing better hiring somebody to work with you, which is why, more people are looking at self-publishing. If they're going to outsource all of the things that publishing houses supposedly provide, that's for our next conference. But, it cost me a lot of money, but I felt that I really wanted someone working with me in that way.
My experience was similar to Susan's. In my first book in particular, I had a really good editor who I didn't talk to until I had finished my a draft that I felt I could share with him. And he came up to my farmhouse in New Hampshire, and we sat down for 3 days and went through the things, and he, knew where to put his finger. When you're writing, at least when I'm, there are times you think you've solved the problem, you've moved on. You didn't quite do that quite right. You also usually have at least some sort of sense, I did this one pretty good. Sometimes you're blindsided. You thought it was really good and it stinks. But the ones where you think they're weak, they're weak. But you try to move on. And he was very good at just, putting his finger on those things and say, I think these need more work. And he had a couple structural things on a couple of chapters that were very helpful. Since then, I haven't had that experience with editors.
I just want to add this in only because I think it's explains a little bit why I think one has that kind of relationship with your publisher and your editor, which is, honestly, you are selling yourself to your publisher all along. And I don't know if you had this experience, but what I wanted was my publisher to think, oh, this is going to be a great book, it's going to be a great book, and when they get it, to make sure they felt it was a great book so they were going to get behind it and promote it. I didn't want to call them midway and say, I hate this book, it's awful, no one's going to want to read it. I didn't want to reveal to them any of my anxiety. And I know this sounds very cynical, but I actually think that's important, because you start saying to your publishing house, I don't know, I think this book really stinks, no one cares about Rin Tin Tin. They're going to go to they're sitting with the sales force and thinking, oh my God, this has been a total waste of money, this is a bust. So you are selling yourself to your publisher through not only when you turn the book in, but beyond, to keep them engaged with the book, committed to it, willing to spend money on it. So I neither felt comfortable nor do I recommend going to them in your low moments. I really, unless you have been working with an editor for a million years and you can turn to them in those moments, I just don't recommend it. I think you want to go to them with the finished product and say, this is going to be amazing, it's done, now get your ad budget up for me. And, so that's why I would never have said to my editor, could you call me every day because I'm really neurotic and I need that, and imagine him sitting down with the publisher saying, this is a disaster.
I would concur, and I'd say that primarily you are the main advocate for your project from beginning to end. You have to be, as you had said, Dayton, you have to be a great believer, or actually you and also Ken had said, you have to be the first and biggest believer in what you're doing. You have to find a way to rev yourself up every morning in order to get it done, because it's not going to get done if you don't do it. No one else is going to write it if you don't write it, and therefore I think people find other sources of support. Not everybody's going to be able to get their format editor to call them every morning. That's great if you can, and that's a great idea.
If you pay them enough, you can.
Oh, okay. Well, that's
yes. Oh, I should point out that was not a free service.
Oh.
No. I mean, but I think if you're not looking to spend that money, you find another place to go with your moments where you're feeling unsteady about the project or doubtful. I think you're better off having someone to turn to who you can be absolutely naked about saying, I'm lost, or I don't like it, or...
I think Susan, you was a skeptical, intelligent, but skeptical reader, which is your husband, and for me it's Diane, my wife, who reads things, because it's helpful to have somebody, even if they will lessen the skepticism a little bit too, just to at least be intelligent and know you enough to say if it really stinks, they're really going to let you know. But just that somebody is looking at it. I don't think it qualifies necessarily as collaboration, but I find. I have friends who, when they're writing, they simply will not talk about whatever it is they're writing. I am the opposite. If I'm at a dinner party or something, I'll just say, I just start blurting out the story that I'm working on, not necessarily in the precise prose that I'm using, but in the, telling them with the same excitement that Susan so eloquently described. I've got this story I want to tell you, and it goes like this, and da-da-da. And, if their eyes are glazing over, then I am in real panic attack. If they are sort of leaning forward, listening to it, then I'm feeling pretty good. But sometimes I, unconsciously am trying that out, and I guess that counts as collaboration.
What I was trying to say to you was that you have to be your biggest advocate, but that does not mean you don't need support. And what I was going to say is that many writers, what they do is they find people who are doing the same thing, and they create community for themselves. And they find individuals who are ideally at the very same point in the writing process. And in my case, I happen to have found a professor of Italian and a geologist who you would never believe would have anything to do with, you would never think that the things we were working on had anything to do with one another. And in many respects, in terms of the content, they didn't. But because much of narrative is often operating on multiple levels. We seem to be writing about one thing, but ultimately we're all trying to connect with some human story to the larger audience. Ultimately, that is what we're all trying to do. And so, one thing that's really practical for a lot of people is to find an individual. Sometimes it may not be a spouse, because that person maybe they actually have had enough of it because they have to live with it anyway. But someone who's at the same point, and maybe someone who's not just finished the book, because that's the last thing you need when you're just beginning. Someone who just, yay, I got it done, and then you're just starting. So finding someone who's at the same point where you are is a lovely thing, and then you can kind of check in with one another. You can read to one another. I love the idea of reading aloud. My book, I read aloud every word to both those two people and also to my mother, and I found it to be very reassuring, because you begin to find the issues in the work that don't come across. You can glaze over it when you're reading it just on the page. And you get that audience. You can see where the person seems to be reacting or not reacting, as you were describing, Dayton. And that's a really practical way for a lot of people to be able to get through the process.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in reading out loud. I think when you have those problem passages, when you're kind of needy, when you're not so sure, if you read it aloud to someone. And in my case, my wife worked as an editor at NPR for 10 years, and she's got a very good ear. and I have to chase her around the house. She won't actually sit and listen. She's going to get doing multitasking. But I'm literally chasing her into the laundry room and down the hall, reading this problem passage. But she picks it apart, and she finds out what's wrong with it. If you have a passage where you're hitting a snag like that, reading it aloud to someone is often
to yourself.
Or even to yourself. It will solve a lot of those problems. Yeah.
I think that we are well over our expected time. I want to thank you for all of your wonderful questions. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to have our send-off from Gay Talese, who could not give us a better way to end our conference. So we should come back in 10 minutes. Thank you.